Thank you so much to the chair and the task force. It's an honor to be here and also to follow so many insightful and important public comments, remarkable comments. I'm going to start my timer so that I do not go over time. I've confined my remarks to 20 minutes. The big test here is going to be whether the share screen function works. So let's see if it does, and I'll get right underway. If someone could just politely confirm that you can see my, great. So I was asked to speak on housing inequality, housing discrimination, and housing segregation. I'll largely confine my remarks to that. You'll have to forgive me. I was hit with a cold recently, so I may have to grab some tea or tissue during this presentation. I have 4 areas I'm going to cover, and I've organized these areas not in any sequential manner, but rather from factual based to theoretical. So the last section I think will be the most important. I'm going to also speak quickly to make sure I get through everything. The first section is on racial residential segregation, measurement and findings. The second section is on correlates and effects of racial residential segregation. I have a brief set of slides on the racial wealth gap, although I know you're going to have a section on that tomorrow, but its relationship to home ownership. I'm going to talk about the causes and phases of evolution of racial residential segregation. So just some key terms: segregation is the separation of people in any particular area. So occupational segregation could be on the basis of gender, when women are pushed into nursing and men into being physicians, or other forms of occupational segregation. There's public accommodation segregation or education segregation. I'm going to talk mostly, actually exclusively, about housing segregation. Racial segregation is the separation of people on the basis of race. Segregation can happen on any basis: caste, gender, sexual orientation, disability, ability. Racial residential segregation is the spatial separation of people in terms of residence on the basis of race. There have been, for decades, ongoing and unresolved debates about precisely how to measure these phenomena. Let me just show you 3 measures and some updated facts based on the 2020 census. So the first and most popular measure of segregation is called the dissimilarity index, and if I have time, I can explain what this means later. But as of the 2020 census, which came out on August 12th of this year, and then the formatted data came out last month, the black-white dissimilarity score is 55. What this indicates is that 55% of either African Americans in the United States or white Americans, or some combination thereof, would have to move to a different race neighborhood to fully integrate. In other words, this means that we live in a very segregated society. This chart shows the evolution of the dissimilarity index from 1910 to 2020. We just had this created this weekend and has never been published before. But what I want to draw attention to here, and I think is relevant to the task force, is you'll notice that 1910, the black-white dissimilarity score is far lower than it is in 2020. And so when you think of segregation, so often we think of segregation as Jim Crow, which it largely is, or as sort of a post-bellum, post-Reconstruction phenomenon. It's not the case at all. You'll notice that black-white dissimilarity scores here peak in 1970, just when the Fair Housing Act goes into effect. And the overall peak is between 1950 and 1980, meaning the post-war period. This is a byproduct of something I'll talk in the 4th section in my talk, of the post-war period and government activity. This is a chart of dissimilarity scores in the Bay Area. Interestingly and disturbingly, black-white dissimilarity in the 9-county Bay Area is actually higher than it is nationally. You can see it's a 0.574 score. Although it's much like the United States declined, the thing I want to point out here is that white Asian and white Latino dissimilarity has risen since 1970, and in fact does not fall. So white Asian dissimilarity in the Bay Area is essentially where it was in 2010, which is higher than it was in any preceding decade. The second measure of segregation is called the isolation or exposure index. These are a combination of indices, but they measure the flip side of the same thing. It essentially measures what the typical neighborhood or actually average neighborhood of a member of a racial group looks like. So what does this tell us based on the 2020 census data? Nationally, the average white resident of a metropolitan area lives in a neighborhood that's 69% white, 9% black, 12% Hispanic, and 6% Asian. Contrast this with the average African American who lives in a neighborhood that's 41% Black, 34% white, 17% Hispanic, and 6% Asian. In other words, these are demographically different worlds, and so they are fiscally in terms of neighborhood conditions, amenities, and life outcomes, which I'll talk about in a moment. Here is the exposure index is essentially the data that shows different race interactions here based on neighborhoods. The isolation is the figure that shows the percentage same race. Here's the isolation index that shows, the exposure index for Black Americans, 1940 to 2020. This is essentially showing you the percentage of white people in the average Black person's neighborhood. Notice that the average number of white people is 34% in 2020, which is lower than it was in 1950 and significantly lower than it was in 1940. Meaning again that the average typical Black person's neighborhood is much less white in the post-war period than it was beforehand. I also have this data for the Bay Area, but I don't have time to get into it. I'm running really low on time. There's a relatively new measure called the divergence index. The divergence index measures a larger geography to a smaller geography and can measure multiple races at once. Using this measure, we found that 54% of metropolitan regions in the country that have more than 200,000 residents were more segregated as of 2020 than they were in 1990. And almost a quarter were more segregated in 2020 than 2010. In the Bay Area, I'm going to show you a chart in a moment, we found that the Bay Area was significantly more segregated in 2020 than it was in 1970. 7 of the 9 counties in the Bay Area have higher divergence scores in 2020 than in either 1980 or 1990. Only 2 counties have lower scores, Alameda and San Francisco. You can see the scores here. Here's the Bay Area divergence scores over the past 6 decades. This blue line right here is Marin, which is by far the most segregated county in the Bay Area. Okay, so what are some of the correlates and effects? There's just a mountain of research studying either the direct effects of racial residential segregation or the correlates, primarily in the arenas of health, public health, economics, and education and environment. Rucker is going to talk about education, so I'm going to leave that to him. There is just an enormous body of literature on the specific effects of racial residential segregation relating to infant and maternal mortality, asthma, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, lead exposure, and many other health conditions, including COVID-19 infections. There's also research on access to amenities in segregated neighborhoods, particularly segregated communities of color, such as grocery stores, childcare facilities, parks and recreational spaces, safety of those environments, clinics and primary care providers, and even hazardous waste facilities. In a study a few years ago by the chair of sociology at Robert Sampson at Harvard, he claims that lead toxicity may be the major environmental pathway through which racial segregation contributes to the legacy of Black disadvantage in the United States. And there's a number of interesting studies, disturbing studies on that. This is not an abstract problem. The study that was mentioned at the top that we launched, The Roots of Structural Racism, basically looked at life outcomes and correlates across a number of different measures. We found the neighborhood poverty rates were highest in segregated communities of color, 3 times as large as poverty rates in segregated white communities. We found that Black children raised using the Opportunity Atlas, Raj Chetty's Opportunity Atlas, Black children raised in integrated neighborhoods earn nearly $1,000 more per year as adults and $4,000 more per year when raised in white segregated neighborhoods than those raised in highly segregated communities of color. We looked at the relationship between redline neighborhoods using the Hulk maps and found that 83% of neighborhoods that were given poor ratings, as D grades in the Hulk maps, were highly segregated communities of color in 2010s. There's a long tail to government policy here. This is a chart, table 4 in our study, that shows specific life outcomes across these 3 types of neighborhoods: integrated neighborhoods, highly segregated communities of color, and highly segregated white communities. You can see, for example, that median household income is twice as large in highly segregated white neighborhoods as in highly segregated communities of color. Same thing for home values and so on. Even life expectancy has differences. But one of the things I just want to point out is that these are structural features, not individual, because when we look at individuals, we find that they have different outcomes based on race, depending on the environment and the structural conditions of those neighborhoods. So again, Black children growing up in highly segregated white neighborhoods, you can see earn as I said, $4,000 more per year as adults than Black children growing up in highly segregated communities of color. And you can study this later, I just don't have time. Part 3, just an aside on homeownership. I have myself at 9 minutes left, by the way. So here are the most recent homeownership figures by race. As of 2019, white Americans, 73% of white Americans own their own home, 58% of Asians, 47.5% of Latinos, and only 42% of Black Americans. Just as an aside on this aside, the overall racial disparity actually masks even larger generational differences. Black Americans born before 1930 only lag white Americans in terms of homeownership by 5%, but Black Americans aged 35 to 44 have actually a 33.5% disparity. So here's a line chart that shows disparities in homeownership by race. I know you have a panel tomorrow on the racial wealth gap, but I wanted to just outline in relation to housing the consequences of this homeownership gap in terms of Black wealth. So one of the callers noted the effects of the subprime mortgage crisis, which I think is quite important to wealth. For white Americans, home equity is only 43% of net worth compared to 60% for Black Americans, which means that the homeownership gap has a much larger effect on Black wealth than it does on white wealth. So 3 specific figures I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you a chart I put together specifically for this presentation. In 2016, the average Black household net worth was $138,000, while the mean white household net worth was $933,000, $934,000. A relative disparity of 7 times. And by the way, this data is from the Federal Reserve's Consumer Finance Survey, and I have 2019 data I'm going to show you in a moment. But the median difference, not the mean difference, obviously the mean difference is affected by extremely wealthy white people, but if you just look at median, the disparity is even greater. The typical white family had wealth median of $171,000, whereas the typical Black family median had only wealth of $17,000 in 2016. When you exclude housing as part of that wealth, the disparity reaches its zenith of nearly 18.5, leaving Black wealth at just $930 per family. I put this together. I was yesterday specifically for this talk, so this has never been created before to the best of my knowledge. But one of the things I wanted to share about this is look at where Black wealth was after the subprime mortgage crisis, just at $2,200 median per family. Now, the good news is it's gone up, and the good news is the disparity ratio has gone down, but notice that the absolute disparity continues to increase. So a focus on the disparity ratio actually masks significant increases in the absolute disparity. Now I'm going to get to the heart of the talk. What explains racial residential segregation? Well, remarkably, there's no consensus in the academic literature on this. There's 3 common explanations. The first is discrimination in housing markets. This could be homeowner or landlord discrimination. This could also refer to real estate discrimination by realtors. There's a lot of discrimination. A study, the HDS studies commissioned by HUD every 10 years uncover quite a bit of discrimination, as did an interesting undercover research project by Newsday, a newspaper on Long Island, with hidden cameras that uncovered significant discrimination in steering. The second theory is divergent compositional preferences, meaning that different race people have different preferences in terms of the types of neighborhoods they want to live in. The third theory is economic differences between racial groups, that is, differences in income and accumulated wealth produce differences in terms of the types of neighborhoods that those families can buy into. Now, what's interesting is that there are theories to support each of these. There's evidence to support each of these theories, but there's also evidence that undermines each of these theories. So, for example, although there may be differences in compositional preferences, survey data consistently finds that different race families prefer to live in more diverse neighborhoods than they currently do. Also, there is significant evidence using the HDS studies that I mentioned before, the housing discrimination surveys since 1980, that specific instances of housing discrimination have gone down. There are additional explanations. So Maria Kreisen and Kyle Crowder wrote a remarkable book in which they argued the differences in background knowledge of neighborhoods may play a significant role in the search process and also the pre-search process. And they have significant empirical evidence to support this. There's also the theory of white avoidance of Black and Latino neighborhoods. The new economic Nobel laureate, David Card, Edward Glaeser, and Vigdor have propounded this theory as an explanatory factor. The truth is that there is no consensus on which of these theories is the predominant explanation. A lot of people assume it's discrimination, but I actually think structural factors probably lean to either 2, 3, or 4. And I think 5 is probably significant. In fact, I think all of these play a role. It's just there's no consensus in the literature. I have a little over 3.5 minutes left according to my timer. These are some heuristics that I've created when I talk about housing segregation to think about it. Very broadly, there are, I think, 3 phases in the evolution of racial residential segregation in the United States. The first phase is what I call the local real estate industry era. Remember, I showed you the dissimilarity index chart earlier that shows that actually dissimilarity scores from 1900 were relatively low across the United States, and they actually were lower in the South in many cases. The primary driver here in 1900 and 1930 was actually local government and the local real estate industry and neighborhood associations pushing for restrictive deeds. These were deed provisions that prohibited individual sellers from selling to people of particular race, and eventually restrictive covenants, which played a much larger role in new subdivisions and developments that prohibited on a large scale basis new developments, homes in those developments being sold to people of particular races or even religions, in many cases, excluding, for example, Jewish people or non-Christian people from buying homes. The second era is what I call the federal government era. Extends and deepens. This is 1930 to 1970, and the primary mechanisms were segregated public housing and then, of course, redlining through the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the FHA. Now, there's a lot of debate here as to whether government caused or simply deepened or extended it. You can look up this literature between Richard Rothstein and Richard Walker, for example. I take the position the federal government came in and sort of extended and deepened what was happening at the local level. And as such, spread it and deepened it across the United States. And then there's the third era, which is 1970, post-Fair Housing Act to the present. The primary mechanisms of sustaining and perpetuating racial residential segregation are sort of zoning and exclusionary land use power, municipal power, incorporation, fiscal policies, and the like. Down to a little minute and 45 seconds. Just to give you a little bit more information on this, there have been, in the last 10 years, some remarkable large-scale mapping projects, mapping racially restrictive covenants in about 10 cities. The 2 large ones that began were in Minneapolis and Seattle, and they've uncovered in both of those regions about 25 specific, proven, established instances of racially restrictive covenants across the region. Other regions' documentation projects are underway. It will be some time until we actually have great comprehensive data on racially restrictive covenants. We do have now digitized over 200 redlining maps. Those are available online, and they're actually also on the interactive mapping tool for our Roots of Structural Racism project. We have also done a number of zoning maps in the Bay Area and found, this is, by the way, our Roots of Structural Racism segregation map. There's strong correlation, as I mentioned, between segregation and these other features. Opportunity Atlas looks at this. This is the zoning map we created for the Bay Area. We found that when you account for every municipality, including those that are under 10,000 people, 85% of all residential land is zoned exclusively for single-family zoning, which excludes multifamily developments. And here's the correlation between single-family zoning and race. As you increase the percentage of single-family zoning, you go heavily white in the Bay Area, and the percentage Black goes to 1%, and Latino collapses. So there's a strong correlation between racial residential segregation and zoning. I have 2 slides left, which I don't really have time to get into, so maybe I can address them in the Q&A on de jure and de facto. Oops. So I just have 2 slides on that. If you'd like to ask about that, I'd love to get to that. I'll stop there.